Chris Tierney, Paul Grasowitz, Brendan Keene, Sharon Pandak. I've asked them to come and react to the fundamental question of how to pay for growth, and in so doing, share maybe their experience personally, professionally, their locality, and any reactions to Mike's comments relative to his presentation. Chris, we'll start with you. Again, Frederick County, another fast-growing jurisdiction, northern tier of the Commonwealth. County planner for a long time, now on the administrative side, does some work with the money side of the operation. He's not in any way here as an expert with their system, but he has knowledge of the system, and in like fashion to Charles, I think will present you with a rationale for why they do what they do.
Well, it might be helpful to try and give perspective, I guess. Loudoun County, you've heard from, and is certainly one end of the spectrum. Frederick County is located not too far to the west of Loudoun. We're at the tip of the state of Virginia, under the West Virginia Panhandle. Our population, 2012, was 80,000. We are, quote, a fast-growing locality. We've grown about 30% over the last, decade. We grow roughly 3% a year. So that translates for us in the 80s and 90s. Throughout those decades, we averaged about 600 new homes a year. In 2005, we peaked at double that, at about 1,200. In 2012, to give you a comparison, we issued 286 building permits. So when things tanked, they really tanked in our locality. Year to date through April, we've issued 110 building permits for new residents. So that's about where we were last year. So it remains to be seen how the rest of the year goes, but we would anticipate being somewhere around 300 probably, unless things pick up over the summer, which they might do. 2013, our school enrollment was 13,000. That makes us the 19th largest school district in the state. We've got 18 schools, 11 elementary schools, 6 of which we've built since 1995. We've got 4 middle schools, one of which we built since 95, and another one is on the drawing board right now. We've got 3 high schools, one of which has been built since 1995. We've also built a public safety building, a school transportation facility, and we're in the process of building the first county-owned fire station. The 2 schools that are in our CIP right now that we built in the next few years, middle school and high school, the combined estimated cost for those is about $100 million. Our fiscal year budget that we just adopted is $329 million. Our real estate tax is 58.5 cents. Our personal property tax is $4.86. Of that $329 million, 51% of that is for schools. Our general fund is $127 million. 65% of the funding for that general fund revenue comes from real estate tax. You compare that, 13% is other local taxes, 9% is our sales tax, and 6% comes from the state. As a fast-growing in relative term, locality, we qualified to use the new old form of proffers that you heard about earlier today in 1989. We actually approved our first conditional rezoning in 1995, so that's part of the reason I use that as the benchmark in terms of capital facilities that we've had to construct since that time. We also qualify for transportation impact fees, and in roughly 2007, we did a very in-depth analysis of whether or not it was worth the effort to try and make use of that. We actually talked extensively with Stafford County. We took a look at how they do things, and we determined, for lack of a better term, that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. It's an extremely complex process to go through. You're fairly limited in what you can get impact fees for and how much you can get, and it just became more cumbersome than what we felt it was worth to try and implement. We have a computer impact model that was developed by a consultant, paid consultant that came to the county. We've had a model since the early 90s. It's now in about its fourth or fifth iteration. We've had numerous different consultants over time. The most recent model was developed in 2005. And that's the model we've used since, although we update the inputs to the model every year. And I'm not going to go into great detail because it's a computer model, and I put myself as well as the rest of you to sleep if we really tried to delve into it. But I'll give you what we go through every year in terms of some of the inputs. It includes our tax rates, our county operating budget, our CIP, school enrollment figures and existing capacity, our population, our persons per household, our pupil generation rates based on housing types, number of existing jobs by categories, average revenue per square foot of existing development by type, number of emergency responses for our fire and rescue and other emergency services. So all that data gets updated with current year figures every year, and we run the model, and it gives us an annual projected impact, capital facilities impact. The current year's model, our anticipated proffer for a single family home is around $19,000. And that goes down for a townhouse, it's about $13,000, and for an apartment, it's about $11,000. Those figures are shared with the Board of Supervisors. We have a committee that's made up of Planning Commission members, staff, top of Virginia Building Association, that reviews the annual update and makes a recommendation to our Board of Supervisors. Since 1995, again, the year that I sort of benchmark with, we've spent on capital facilities $192 million. We've taken in proffers $9.25 million. So over that period of time, we accumulated enough money to build roughly a third of an elementary school. So like Loudon, for us, what we derive in proffers is just a drop in the bucket in terms of our capital facilities needs. We have had, since the 1990s, an urban development area where we try and encourage growth to occur. It's where our sewer and water services are made available. It's where most of our transportation dollars go for road maintenance, things of that nature. On average, about a third of the houses built in our county are built in that urban development area, which we try and encourage. We also have a large agricultural area within the county, and probably a third of the homes built in the county are built in that rural agricultural land by right. We have 1 unit per 5 acre by right zoning. And then we have a couple of residential recreational communities that are small lots with utilities, private, that were constructed back in the 70s, and they also take probably about a third of our annual development. So within that urban development area where we try and focus our housing development, that's where most of our rezonings would occur. The issue that we have is that a lot of the land that houses are being built on today, that land was zoned back in the 70s, prior to our ability to accept proffers. So only a fraction of the homes built within Frederick County are even subject to proffers. So for that reason, we've always been very interested in impact fees or some other form of revenue that would cast a broader net. And I would say we kind of agree with the homeowners or home builders association in that there is an inherent inequity in proffers. And from my perspective, the issue comes down to who pays. The local residents that vote for our elected officials are not interested in paying for what they perceive as a need that is derived by the rampant growth that goes on in our county. We've built, again, nearly half the schools we've built have been built since 1995. So it's an interesting phenomenon. I don't think there's any simple answer, but I do agree that proffers as they're currently structured are not the answer. And hopefully we, as a Commonwealth, can with a revenue stream other than local real estate tax to help localities pay for growth.
Very good. Chris, have you all done a calculus as to, say, no proffers, what increment on that 58.5 cents would be in terms of making change away?
No, and again, just this is complete anecdotal, but my observation has been that if I buy a house in our urban development area that's subject to proffers, and I buy the same house out in the rural area of the county, I'm not going to pay $15,000 less for that county out in the rural, or the house out in the rural area. So, do proffers drive up the cost of housing? I'm not foolish enough to think that the builders aren't passing that cost along. But, is there a one-to-one correlation? I would say no. So, what would the impact to be if we were to do away with proffers? We utilize proffers because we can, and it's a source of revenue. In my estimation, we'd be foolish not to try and take advantage of it. But what the impact would be dollar for dollar.
Fair enough, yeah. Brandon, let's go to you, sir, if you don't mind. Brendan is an attorney, but he also is, the Chamber of Commerce, right? You're the
President. I'm the chairman of the.
Yeah.
Let me. I believe everybody has some sort of bias. So I want you to know what my biases are. I am a developer lawyer, but I've also represented local governments. Paul and I represented Amelia County for 2 years when Paul worked with our firm. I've represented local governments in the Tidewater area on zoning and land use issues. But I usually, in Central Virginia, I'm a developer guy because those are our clients. And in my role as chairman of the Chesterfield County Chamber of Commerce, we are a very politically active organization to get involved in local issues. And we've been very involved on the cash proffer debate in Chesterfield. Andrew reported earlier that if you read the paper, it says that Chesterfield decided to keep the cash proffer the same. What really happened was they kicked the can down the road. Because what they said is, we're not going to change it right now, but staff, we want you to come back to look at this, and this. The reality is they're kicking the can down the road past the meals tax referendum in November so that they don't have to deal with the cash proffer issue and be perceived as giving developers a giveaway when they're asking the taxpayers to pay more when they go to a restaurant.
And some citizens in the county have arrived at a similar conclusion.
That's right. So we've really, it was interesting to hear the discussion about Loudon and demographics because I do think Loudon's unique. Chesterfield and Loudon are very close in population right now, but Chesterfield's growth over the past has slowed. It's not as robust, nearly as robust as Loudon's. It's went up 23% from 2000 to 2013 in terms of population. What I think we are seeing in Chesterfield in this discussion about cash proffers is a recognition that the growth is not the same as it was before. And in the early 90s, when the growth was really robust, it was easy to see that every dwelling unit created an impact. It was easy to calculate. It was simple math. Now, it's not. But the county is still using the same model that they used in the early 90s. And it just doesn't fit. And the problem that the county is struggling with is, well, what model does fit? How do you fairly calculate the impact? I've been working on this for a while with the folks in Chesterfield, and I think, candidly, I don't know if there is a fair way that you can come up with the impact within the cash proffer system. Right. And here's a couple of examples. Chesterfield has segmented the cash proffer to different categories, and one of those is schools. Roughly $5,000 of the cash proffer falls schools, give or take, $8.
Out of the nearly $19,000 profit.
Out of the nearly $19,000.
$8 goes to the school.
Right. Chesterfield's they just adopted a comprehensive plan And in that comprehensive plan, they recognize that school growth is going to be flat to negative for the next 10 years. The calculation on the projected growth of the last 10 years were wrong. And if, for those of us in the real estate industry who follow demographics, we knew this was coming. Loud is the exception because of this particular economy, but I'm a Gen Xer. I was born in '69, so that 65 to 84 group is a lot smaller than the baby boomers and the Gen Y group. There are just fewer of us producing children out there that can produce children. So school populations, like in places like Chesterfield and Chesapeake is another place that's been struggling with this issue that has the same problem, where they actually have declining enrollments. Even though population is going up, enrollments are flat to declining. How can you justify having a cash proffer when you know that you don't have to build any schools?
Excellent point.
But I think the real challenge is for a community that already has a cash proffer. Once you have that revenue source, the nature of government is to hang on to the revenue source rather than give it away. I mean, how often do you get tax cuts more than tax increases? And that's the nature of government. It's the hedge against the future. Where I see this going is, and we're already seeing this in certain localities with litigation, is that it's becoming harder and harder in those places to justify the cash proffer, and you're going to end up with litigation because you can't show a reasonable relationship between the impact and the amount of money that's suggested that should be paid. And the General Assembly, in the most recent session, put a fine point on that. I think, and others may agree or disagree with me, I think it's always been assumed that cash proffers can only be used to deal with expansions, an impact that requires an expansion of public facilities, new public facilities. One locality decided they were going to change their cash proffer policy to allow to use that money for what they call non-routine maintenance and for technology upgrades. And that created a backlash in the General Assembly, and the General Assembly passed legislation that made it clear that you can only use cash proffers monies for expansions, not for renovations, for maintenance, but it has to be an expansion. So the definition of impact is really tied to is that residential unit going to require the government to build more facilities? And we're really getting to the point where that's really, that line is harder and harder to define. The other issue we have in the real estate industry is the Gen Y group coming along sees real estate very differently than the boomers or the Xers do. They are very much non-car oriented. They're very urban oriented, mixed use oriented. Their focus is much different. And how do you account for the impacts of someone making those choices versus what we have historically seen over the past 50 years, which is suburban type development, which creates greater stresses on public facilities than on high density infill development? How do you deal with that? And that's why I think really there's a confluence of changing demographics and changing decisions of the different generations about where they want to buy and where they want to live that really make the cash proffer system not the right fit to deal with the impacts. I think that's really where we're going.
And that's one of the reasons I invited Brendan to be with us. In part, not only because of his intellect, but also his insight. Several of you were probably thinking when he said we're going to go from 8 million to 12 million, and you probably running through your mind the fire trucks, the schools, the ball fields, etc. But I know what was running through Mike's mind, and I figured what was running through Brendan's mind, is that what type of population growth are we going to experience? If we grow by 2, 3, 4 million, what's that going to mean in terms of what are we talking about? Old farts might be around until they're 90 or 100 years old, okay? Ain't producing kids for the school system. I live in Chesterfield too. I have a bias though. I want to pay those taxes because I want workers out there assuring me that that Social Security check continues to come and that Virginia retirement check continues to come, okay? So I have a vested interest in quality schools, much like Mr. Tolson, and I have grandchildren too. But Brenda, you hit on something very powerful, and I don't think our proper models take that into exact consideration. Loudon is unique for a lot of different reasons. Frederick is a little more approximating a lot of jurisdictions in the Commonwealth. But how are we changing? What is that new population looking like? Just because we're growing doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the little rugrats, native biters that become school-age children, okay? And if we don't have as many of them, should we not then revisit? And I think you're touching on something that's central that a lot of us haven't thought about at the local level, okay? Very intriguing remarks. Paul, let's go to you. You've been on that study committee. Just finishing up your work.
Hey, before Paul says something, just so that there's no misunderstanding, I wrote a letter to the Board of Supervisors that was very critical of Paul's decision and his committee, but I did say I didn't think that they really had everything they needed to do. So,
yeah, we came forward with a recommendation to reduce the cash buffer by 40%, and that wasn't good enough.
How'd you arrive at that?
And we got to oppose that.
Yeah, how'd you all arrive at that?
Let me get to that first. You know, we first had the claim that we're moving towards higher density development, and that results in lower expenditures on local government. Yet when you look at the Home Builders Paying for Growth research report, on page 4, the finding of their own report says that in preparing this report, we found that higher density communities had generally higher local government expenditures per capita. Further, the study found in general that actual spending per capita was lower in newer, more suburban communities. In short, the savings that many growth management advocates ascribe to high density development are overstated. So in their own research report, they contradict their statements that, well, if we move to get away from sprawl and move to higher density development, we're going to have lower costs on local government. You have a page in your package of an orange page that has some insights from me. Back in January of this year, Mike and I had kind of dueling columns in the Richmond Times-Dispatch Sunday commentary section, kind of a for and against type aspect. And just a couple of, just to react to some of the things that Mike has said and what's been said today, residential development is not economic development. You don't have any of your economic development staff going around the country or going around the state trying to attract subdividers to come in and develop properties, because that's going to lead to a greater economic good and more tax revenue for the county. They're going after businesses that pay a whole variety of business taxes, from professional occupational regulation taxes to all various types of real and tangible personal property tax, whereas the methodology that localities put together to calculate the cash buffer, and you've seen Loudon's example, and if you look at the examples, say, of Chesterfield counties on their website and other localities, when I was in Powhatan County, we hired a name accounting firm in the Richmond area to come out and calculate our cash buffer and to take a look at what does the house, the average house produce in tax revenue, and what does the average house per capita cost the locality in terms of providing school services and emergency services and parks and libraries and so forth, and it was always a deficit. And that's where the cash buffer comes from. And what the cash buffer does is try to make up that deficit. Now, it's hard to argue that the cash buffer is limiting or inhibiting residential development. You don't accomplish 80% growth rate over 10 years, or 43% in Prince William County, or 51% in Chesterfield during the last 20 years that they had cash proffers, if it's somehow restricting residential development. It just doesn't make sense. Hull Street was mentioned and Woodlake. You know, when you look at that, you have to look at the time frame. We're talking about a 20-year time frame. Sure, business eventually showed up on Hull Street down by the 288 interchange after Brandermill and Woodlake and other big residential developments came in over the previous 15 to 20 years. What you had though was in the meantime is not that economic development, not that business, but all those new residences impact on county services. And we ended up with Swift Creek Middle School, which is kind of near Brandermill, that the entire 7th grade was housed in trailers because all those people were bringing in, of course, children and were addressing emergency services and so forth. And it wasn't until years later that Mike could drive down the road and go to a Target or Kohl's or whatever, well after the county had to absorb the impact on their capital facilities. You know, I can state something that's probably controversial and a lot of people will disagree, but I just don't see how a housing industry or the Home Building Association can afford hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years in lobbyists to go to the General Assembly to amend the cash proffer legislation repeatedly, and generally to weaken it. In 2008, they had an intensive effort to try to repeal the cash proffer legislation. They have, political contributions at the state and local level towards accomplishing that. They contract with their research reports and so forth. We hear all these potential litigation coming up and past litigation. You notice the Home Builders Association was the party to those things. So they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees to fight cash proffers. It's hard to believe that you would spend that kind of money in an industry if you weren't paying part of it out of your profit. And you're not passing it all into the price of the house. And I'm sure it's a sharing probably of the three. The home builder's profit, the developer's profit, and going into the price of the house. When I was in Powhatan, a perfect example was a subdivision development where the developer, and Richard Ayers, if he's still here, will remember this, he paid the cash proffer for the home builders as an incentive to get home builders to come in and buy lots. So there he was paying the cash proffer, it's coming out of his ultimate profit as a way to market the lots. So, it's hard to say that cash proffer was going into the price of housing. Basically localities have from Loudoun County to Richmond, Spotsylvania, Stafford, James City, the whole corridor have approved rezoning after rezoning, hundreds of thousands of acres rezoned residential, hundreds of thousands of new homes built, when they could have developed, as we've seen in other parts of the country, very restrictive growth management strategies to slow that growth down and not have all those houses built. And we have suburban counties in this state that don't have that type of growth rate. But instead that has happened, and you've accommodated residential development, and the locality is simply asking, all right, you help share in the cost of building the public facilities to serve the development because of the need that you are generating. And we're not asking you to pay everything. You're paying a portion of the public facilities cost, and all the long-term operating costs, personnel, books, fire engines, and so forth, are being paid by the taxpayer. And if none of that residential development occurred, you wouldn't have to build a new school. Powhatan was the 5th fastest growing county when we were out there. And they had a high school, and an elementary school, and a middle school, and by the time I left, they had a brand new high school and 2 more elementary schools. They needed the cash proffer to help pay for those facilities because they were willing to accommodate new residential development. The communities on either side, Amelia, Goochland, and so forth, weren't. And they didn't have that type of impact on public facilities.
So it'd
So,
be,
so to tie it back into the citizen committee, the county set up a citizen committee to look at the cash proffer policy after they saw what was going on in Hampton. This is the span from February to April. The board made recommendations to the county administrator. The county administrator appointed 5 individuals. They appointed a executive vice president for a fairly good-sized residential developer in Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, Stafford County area. Obviously a proponent of cash proffers. They appointed me based on my experience at the local level and knowledge of cash proffers and the government side of the issue. And then they had 3 citizens who knew nothing about cash proffers themselves. We had an accountant work for the feds. We had a lawyer that worked for the Virginia Tourism or State Tourism, but state winery group. And we had a retiree who had worked for state agencies. And they listened to both sides of the equation, as you've heard today. And they saw that, as in that illustration you have in that packet I gave you, that for those 5 types of capital facilities that cash proffers are going to help pay for, it's 20% of the value. And for the FY14 to FY18, we are planning to build new schools, expand existing schools, new fire stations. If you look at the comprehensive plan, there's new fire stations to try to maintain their 5-minute turnaround on getting to someone's house. So they do have ongoing expenses. And the result was that a majority of the committee decided that the cash proffer was appropriate. It was a fair way of sharing the cost of what development puts on local government for public facilities. We did come up with a strategy to lower it by focusing on those public facilities that are of local responsibility and significantly reduce the portion of the cash proffer that went to roads, because roads are the state responsibility. And we had this, the governor was successful in getting through his major new funding for roads, so there was less of a need for road funding. And we ended up saying, yes, we do need to have the cash proffer. We suggested it should be lower for 1-bedroom apartments and condos because they don't generate the same number of children. I had recommended that the cash proffer should be less or none in targeted revitalization areas. If the public facilities were not over capacity, I suggested that in mixed-use developments where you have 25-30% commercial tied to residential at the same time, not with a 10-year lag, cash proffer probably wasn't needed in the mixed-use development because you had the commercial development coming in at the same time to help compensate for it. But the bottom line was it was a proposal to reduce it by 40%. And as you heard, the Chamber of Commerce and home builders and everybody came out in opposition to it. And now they have to live with the 18-9 for another year. They may very well be waiting until after the referendum on, the bond referendum on school improvements and the proposal for a meals tax to raise more revenue. But, you know, anytime you put something off, or you don't grab something that's in front of you, you know, you have a 40% reduction, bring that $19,000 proffer down, or $18,000 proffer down to 11. Do you grab it, or do you risk a year later, maybe the board isn't going to react the way you think they are? And a key factor in there that I would suggest my business associates here, so to speak, is the Tea Party around the state is becoming more and more vocal, and they're not going to accept any type of tax increase. And the governing bodies know that, and it'd be suicide for them to raise taxes. And so that's why the cash proffer becomes a way to help fund public facilities so you can accommodate residential development while not raising taxes and finding yourself, if you're an elected official, or you as planning commissioners who are appointed by elected officials, out of a job.
Okay, well, Sharon, maybe your reaction to what you've heard, but also the central question of how to pay for new growth. And who should pay?
There are a couple of sections, if you look at the state code, that we get used to reading or knowing about all the time, and I'm not going to read them to you, but I'm going to tell you to go back and look at them, and their legislative intent with respect to the whole section on how you deal with planning, subdivision, and land use. That says, in pertinent part, the development of communities with adequate highway, utility, health, educational, and recreational facilities, healthy surroundings for family life in residential areas. And then you go to the comp plan language that is in 15.2, 22, 20, I realize I talked that long.
22, 23.
And you go through that, and you look at 22, 23, as Mike mentioned, you look at the aspects with respect to the zoning ordinance when you get over to 2280, and all through that is a discussion of not just building houses, but building communities and supporting those communities. So the bottom line is, if you build those communities, and this is the kicker, how does growth impact the tax rate? And the modest proposal, and I won't get into annexation, Mike, but the modest proposal that Chris kind of dropped at the end of his is that you have to remove the dependence on the real estate tax in order to deal with this problem in any comprehensive way. And instead what we get are very fine advocates like Mike and others who go to the General Assembly and say, tinker with this, tinker with that, and the General Assembly operates in silos. And so they tinker, and in some cases it looks like a mortgage workout on some of these cash proffers, and not a good one. They tinker when in fact the laboratories ought to be at the local level if you're going to modify this, because the problems are that the cash proffers solve a financial issue and they solve a political issue. Now they're always a smaller percentage than all the other public money that is going into to taking care of public facilities. But at the local level, that's the alternative they came up with as being making the system work. And there is, and I hate to say this because it dates me, but there is an amnesia among the development community about the 70s. And in Fairfax County, you had what would have been in Virginia known as the 100 Years' War equivalent, only it happened in a decade or so. When Fairfax County had problems like Loudon, and they tried to do something about it because they couldn't handle the growth. And so there were at least 8 cases, in which Fairfax County got sued by various landowners, went to the Supreme Court, lost a lot. Whether or not they lost, what happened was that some very agile minds at the General Assembly, and different people claim credit for it now, said enough is enough. We're wasting a boatload of attorney's fees, if nothing else. We're causing constant confusion. Nobody knows what's going on as to what development's going to be or not be in Fairfax County. So that's where the proffer system really gelled, because they said we got to do something better. Now, I'm not a huge advocate of the profit system as the perfect system. I have reviewed and helped write proffers that went from a couple pages to 40 pages, some of which were cash proffers. And it's a royal pain in the neck to put them together. And because they become law, and you have to make sure they're enforceable, and a whole bunch of things on both sides, both the developer's attorney and the local government attorney. And if you're gonna do proffers, you need to get in there as a locality and make sure they're enforceable and do them right. Because otherwise you have a lot of problems as well, because they're not enforceable. And yet you trigger perhaps some vesting issues. But what the cash proffers do, along with the rest of the conditional zoning system is allow development to function and to build harmonious communities and to remove the 100 Years' War aspect where everybody goes and sues everybody all the time. And relocates those resources to where they're productive. So we need to sort of understand that context, even though it's an imperfect system. And at the local level, the studies like that Charles has ended up with in Chesterfield, that Charles has in Loudon that are constantly doing, that Chris is constantly doing in Frederick, that they're doing in Chesterfield, that in Prince William you're doing over and over again to justify the numbers, are going to continue to occur for a couple of reasons. One, because the home building and the development industry comes in and says, we want to know that those numbers are good numbers. And we want to know that if you're doing offsets, the offsets work. That's a pain in the neck too, but it's not bad. Because then you can sort it out locally. But going to the General Assembly and saying that the Loudon proffer numbers are so huge, when for some localities, you're not getting houses at that price range in some very, very rural parts of Virginia, doesn't work. Because the General Assembly they see the silos, they don't see the perspective of how it works in Loudon, and how it works in a different way in Frederick, and how it might work in a different way in Chesterfield, and how in Prince William that it works. Because and this is not confidential, but years ago when we were looking at what do you do in Prince William with the comprehensive plan, you have half of the county that is designated as being rural. And for the first time, the county executive brought in the financial people, the budget people, and the planners together. And we did what Mike says, and you've got to do it. You've got to put together a realistic CIP. And he said, okay, what's it going to cost if the west end of the county develops? And everybody looked at each other and go, no. And he said, well, you better come back. Because that's not the right answer. And so in a couple of weeks, came back. And it was a large number at the time. Now the number doesn't sound so large. And he said, well, how's that going to be paid for? Do we believe the state will give it to us? Do we believe we can get it off the real estate? Who makes up the difference if this develops? And that framed how the county both developed its comprehensive plan and how it looked at its proffer system. And was it an easy debate? No, it was very contentious. Was that okay? I think probably it was okay. Did we get sued on the comp plan? No. Which means that somebody reached a conclusion this is pretty reasonable. And so we need to sort of look at, and I will say, you can't buy into believing proffers do everything. That's the proffer Kool-Aid. Don't drink it all that way, because you don't ask for, kill the goose that laid the golden egg. But on the other hand, you need to look at what the proffer does in terms of medicine and making that whole system work. And I think when you look at the other alternatives that are out there, impact fees, we have tried to put together on a number of occasions in localities I work with. It's very difficult. And you wonder whether it's worth the effort. When you look at things like CDAs, Community Development Authorities, I think we did some of the first ones in Prince William County. They're hard to put together. Some of them work, some of them never get off the ground, and you're just, again, going through either extensions or reworkings, and they don't yield the difference. And then the kicker is when they come in and they say, well, we gave you a cash proffer, but we want to fund it with a CDA, and maybe you can do something from the public side on top of that. And then you wonder if you've gone around in a full circle. So it's really important to sort out locally both something that makes sense, that evolves and is constantly being massaged, and also doesn't end up backing you back into the same problem. Tax increment financing has a lot of appeal, But when you take off certain amounts of money and locate them into one area, you may not have the funding that allows you to cover the general public costs in the locality as a whole. So there are no silver bullets, and what we would like is a silver bullet. I think that ideally would be it, and those of us who don't have to face the political winds can say, yeah, let's give you some more taxing options, because then you have that flexibility if you have a corporate income tax that's higher, if you have different personal income taxes, if you do this and this, all of this stuff, which if I were on camera and were running for office again, I would have just shot myself in the foot. But we need to, as a public, realize that there may be a cost benefit to us as taxpayers if we look at multiple taxing sources that allow more flexibility at the local level. And I think that ultimately ends up being the silver bullet. And then finally, I will say something that I found very interesting. I really like this report, Mike, so thank you. It's very interesting in one of the comments. I don't agree with let's turn all the public facilities into private facilities, partly because they're called public facilities for reasons, and you may separate and make gaps between the haves and the have-nots if you do that. Plus, I just read a Kessler book called Blue Gold, which if you ever think you should turn all your private water systems, your systems into private water systems, it really freaks you out. But the points that I think are really important that we have not gotten a grasp on at all, and if we as a country are going to move forward, we have to, and that is innovation and how we provide and build those public facilities. And I think you're absolutely right, Mike, that the banking industry is frustrating those efforts to deal with those innovations, which would allow us to provide the public facility, whatever it does, in a more effective way, so that we, for example, we may not build our schools out, 1 story or 2 stories going. We may build them up. We may build them into hills. Whole different creative, our sewer and water systems are the ones that perhaps could benefit most from very, very new technologies that perhaps aren't tried here. And then you can bring those costs down, because there does need to be a way to bring down those public facility costs in order to make it work. But to go back to where I started, we got to not have amnesia about how we got to the cash proffer system today. And we need not think that it is the be-all and the end-all, but until we can get to more diverse tax sources at the local level, we should leave local governments with the ability, the flexibility to sort out and to deal with the arguments for and against in that regard, and kind of temper it as it goes through. And for that reason, I think at this point in time, cash proffers are probably better than not. And you shouldn't be scared, because you're going to have the Loudon cash proffer if you talk about them, because you're not Loudon. And you shouldn't be scared if even Frederick sounds a little high for you, because you're not Frederick. But there are lots of really good consultants out there who can crunch
But
the
look
numbers.
at both models.
You can look at all, and you massage it as to
Right.
how.
The model
use
is
those
what's critical,
concepts.
Charles. The concept is what, yeah, there's only one left.
I respond.
Yes, please.
What I'd like to say is that I didn't get a chance to comment on impact fees. My organization believes, one, they're not fair. They're not fair because why should I move out of Wood Lake and to a new home across Hull Street and pay an impact fee when somebody can come out of Maryland and buy my house with 6 children and pay nothing? I mean, there's some fundamental principles of taxation in this nation. They have to be fair. They are not fair. I think I gave you the example. They have to be dependable. Look at my chart. They're not dependable. They have to be broad-based. They're not. Every tax you look at in this nation, it meets those criteria. And they have to be efficient to collect. Maybe they're easy to collect. The second thing I'd like to say is that, our dues are $130. I don't know how far. I think we can probably I can go out and show you my 2007 GMC with 170,000 miles. Our total budget, $600,000. We're not millionaires, we don't spend thousands on lawyers. The last thing I would say is those retail organizations are there now. They may not have been 20 years ago. They're there now, they're because of the housing rooftops that are there. Why don't you include them in your formula now?
Exactly.
It seems to me it'd be only fair. And last, I agree with this. And what's interesting is, I don't see VACO and VML, I don't want to bust them, they're my buddies, but why are they advocating for more public funding for public education? You know why we got a transportation bill passed? Because I put my ass on the line for 10 years until it finally happened. I got sent to the speaker's office time after time. Why are you for this? Well, because there's a fundamental taking place in America. They're transferring through this proper system the responsibility for public roads to the private sector because you're not funding it. I mean, we were a critical component when the governor had his big press conference. I was stood right beside him. Organization got mentioned 3 times as been giving credit for the passage of that transportation bill. We're now there, we've been there saying you need to fund public education like the Constitution requires you to do. And they don't do it. We're still going to be there. I agree. It's about money. Localities, especially counties, need broader, more flexible ways to tax people. Like cities have, through the governing bodies. And oh, by the way, the Tea Party thinks properties are taxes too. Can't take impact fees of taxes. You know, we need to keep talking. We need to keep having forums like this. Maybe if we could get together and lock arms like we did on transportation, we could, come to solutions. I happen to think devolution in a few large counties would be appropriate under the right circumstances. I mean, I'm in Hanover County all the time. My God, the roads in that place are palatial compared to Chesterfield County, where if you go off a 24-foot wide road, you're hitting a tree as big as this room is. I don't know why I'm
Heading down to a massive series of subdivisions. Makes no damn sense. I agree with you. Mike, we're at the witching hour, and I think that this was not designed to solve a problem. It was designed to bring our attention to the reality that government costs money. You and I, people, we cost money. We have a service demand. And we need to be looking at, and I agree with Sharon and Mike and Brendan, and I think the panel at large, that we need the creativity, we need the innovative thinking, and those things sometimes don't go hand in hand with government as we know it. But it is at the local level that the experiments must take place. It's at the local level that is where the action is where we're going to have to make a consequential difference. And I think that does require the locking of arms and the holding of hands. And people might say, well, what are you doing next to him or her? We're all Virginians. We're all interested in having communities that provide us with a quality of life that we enjoy. And we ought to make the state accountable. You're exactly right. Imagine if the state was paying the bill they are obliged to pay for education. Why aren't we demanding the General Assembly membership to do their due diligence? That would free up money for us locally. I thank Charles, I thank Andrew, I thank everyone for giving their time today. I hope it's been of some benefit to you, get you thinking, and that's what we want to do. Thank you. You take your home, everybody, to the green.